He called and they followed. Supporters of jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny defied the authorities and came out onto the streets in their thousands. Navalny's arrest on his return to Moscow after being treated in Germany for a poison attack hasn't stopped him yet. So what could happen next? This is Roundtable. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Shuli Ghosh. He's the leading critic of Russia's longtime president, Vladimir Putin. So the return of Alexei Navalny was always likely to lead to a confrontation with the Kremlin. Russian police made more than 3,000 arrests on Saturday during demonstrations that attracted tens of thousands of people. Protesters demanded the release of Navalny, who was arrested on his return to Moscow from Berlin on the 17th of January. He had treatment in Germany after being poisoned with a nerve agent last August. Russia's government has dismissed allegations it was involved. Navalny's arrest sparked sharp reactions from global leaders, including the US and European officials, adding to the tensions between Russia and the West. After a court ordered a 30-day jail term for Navalny, he released a video statement. Don't be afraid, take to the streets, he said, a call to his supporters to protest. Following his arrest, Navalny's team released a video investigation claiming President Vladimir Putin spent illicit funds on an extravagant Black Sea palace.
Today we will see what is considered impossible to see up close. We will go where no one is allowed. We will pay Putin a visit and see with our own eyes that this man, in his craving for luxury and wealth, has gone completely mad.
The investigation alleges the property cost more than $1.3 billion and was paid for with, quote, the largest bribe in history. The Kremlin denies the property belongs to the president. But as the protests gather momentum, how much pressure is Vladimir Putin now under? Well, joining us here on Roundtable from Moscow is Viktor Olevich, lead analyst at the Center for Actual Politics. In Brussels, Theresa Fallon, director at the Center for Russia, Europe and Asia Studies. And in Belfast, Alexander Titov, lecturer in modern European history at Queen's University, Belfast. Good to have all of you with us. Victor, let me start with you because 40,000 people turned out for protests over the weekend across the country, many of them in Moscow. Are you surprised by those numbers?
No, those numbers are not particularly surprising considering the growing disillusionment and disenchantment of especially of the younger generations with the official policies, with certain policies that are quite distant from democratic processes. And so this was long in the making. This is a particularly important year in Russian politics because of the upcoming parliamentary elections in September. And it is expected that these protests will continue and will possibly grow in number as time passes.
I wanted to just talk about the response of the Russian police. Alexander, hundreds of arrests, including briefly Navalny's wife. The fact that people defied the police and came out in such numbers, I mean, clearly that goes to what Victor was saying about the determination and the growing strength of feeling among protesters.
There is always this kind of distinction in Russian protests when there is a sanctioned protest which will be authorized by the authorities and unauthorized one, and authorized ones are the ones which are more dangerous since they are technically illegal, and there is much more danger of police detention or brutality and so forth. So these were ones were unauthorized ones, and having so many people on the streets for such unauthorized protest is certainly very good showing for the opposition. So you have about 3,000 people arrested all over the country on the latest figures. So is one of the highest numbers we've seen in years. I have to say, these unauthorized protests themselves are not unusual. I mean, you have the quite big rallies like this, every so often. 2017 was another one, again led by Alexei Navalny. There was 2019. There were big protests in Moscow as well around the Duma elections. But so they kind of fit into this long series of unauthorized rallies. But this is one by far the largest. And also, what's kind of unusual about it is that it's so kind of widespread geographically that basically every major Russian city would have a protest, and even some much smaller ones as well. So that's kind of what is unusual. And with police, of course, they concentrated in kind of bigger cities. They're not really able to kind of contain them everywhere to the same degree.
Yeah, and Theresa, we saw police beating protesters. We saw police dragging them away. We've heard the condemnations from the US, from the UK, from the EU. But this reaction to an unauthorized protest, I mean, this is pretty much Kremlin's business as usual, isn't it?
Well, it was pretty incredible because the temperatures in some parts of the country were minus 50 Celsius. And the fact that over 109 cities across Russia had coordinated protests, it speaks volumes. So there was a wave of protests across Russia over 11 time zones. And we've seen a strange occurrence. 44% of people were reportedly, it was their first time to protest. So you have a whole new wave of people who are usually at home, maybe sitting on the couch complaining, but they felt now was the time to go out. And I think Navalny's return after the poisoning with Novichok really kind of piqued people's attention that he was so brave to come back. And he said, don't do it for me, do it for yourselves. And in addition to that, it was like a 1-2 punch because he also released a very interesting documentary on Putin's alleged palace. It was a 2-hour documentary. It has over 70 million views. And some of the items documented in the film, he showed receipts for 700 euro toilet bowl brushes. So some of the protesters actually went out waving their own toilet bowl brushes as a interesting metaphor about cleaning up the excrement that they feel that they're experiencing under this current government.
Yeah, let's talk about that that documentary. Victor, this is the accusation that President Vladimir Putin spent illicit funds building a Black Sea palace. Of course, Navalny is well known as an anti-corruption campaigner. Is that accusation against Vladimir Putin gathering traction? Is that putting a lot of pressure on Putin?
Well, what is notable about this film is that the information about the palace in Gelendzhik came out into the open 10 years ago, in fact in 2010, 2011, so much of it was known before. But today, now, it has garnered a lot more attention than it had back then. And this speaks to how the Russian people are viewing the powers that be, are viewing Putin as president, how that is different from the way they viewed him 10 years ago. His ratings are lower today than they were back then. The criticisms leveled against him are much starker, much harsher at times. And also one has to consider the importance and the influence of last year's constitutional referendum, which granted Putin the right to run two more times for president after he was slated to leave office in 2024. Now, even though he had, by official count, won that plebiscite, it wasn't really a referendum, according to Russian law, those who were concerned about the changes, those who opposed those changes, were irritated and are now much more predisposed against the government than they were before. So we can see through the 10-year span how similar information is getting treated differently now than back then, because the relationship, the attitude of the Russian people towards the government has changed, and the tone has become more negative.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I think that we tend to think of the power of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin's grip on power as inassailable. But let me come to you, Alexander, first. On a comment on this, because we now have a situation where people are willing to, even despite a coronavirus pandemic, they're coming out onto the streets in their thousands. You have an opposition leader who is incarcerated, yet he's orchestrating this. He's released this documentary. Is there now a groundswell of opinion where people are more willing to challenge Putin's power?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's kind of several takes on this, but so that there is definitely discontent, and as I said, there has been a long discontent with Putin from some Russians for a long time, and as I said, in 2017 there were large protests as well, not just in Moscow but across the cities, which kind of similar numbers as well. I mean, this time it's much wider, and
is Putin worried by this? Is Putin?
Well, I think he is. I mean, and he came in today and denied on the record that that palace has ever been in his ownership or his close family ownership and so forth. But I think also you have to keep in perspective that the numbers are still not so big that they would necessarily worry them unduly, in a sense that you have around 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 people in large cities of over 1 million, 1.5 million protesting. Okay, bigger in Moscow and say in Petersburg. But basically, you have 0.1% of population of the cities coming out in the street. I mean, that's certainly is problematic for them, and the widespread is problematic. But it's not something they would be necessarily be panicking about.
Theresa, what do you think? If we see the momentum growing and we see the protests continuing in these numbers, could this pose a very serious problem for Putin?
Well, this is the key question. Will the momentum continue? Because we've seen the Kremlin's hard line on Navalny after the Novichok poisoning and when he awoke from his coma. The very first thing he said was, "I'm going to return to Russia," and no one even knew if he would, properly recuperate, because it was a long-haul recuperation. So he seems like an incredibly brave man. And the fact of the matter is, they don't seem to have any compromising information or materials on Navalny. He's clean. So even though they accuse him of many things, there's kind of a deep distrust by the public, and they feel that he's doing good work, and he is a divisive figure because he's a nationalist. Also, he has some xenophobic views. But at the protest, we saw non-COVID believers or COVID deniers and communists and nationalists all coming together. He seems to have turned into a form of a lightning rod. He is the opposition candidate right now. And traditionally, the Kremlin has always used a Voldemort approach to him. They would never say his name, not even mention him. So they called him the patient or the blogger. But now we saw on Sunday on Russian television, they took it on straightforward and they started talking about Navalny. So he's clearly the opposition candidate, and how the Kremlin handles that will be the key issue, because will they continue this hard line, which seems to be strengthening?
This is certainly what seems to be the indication. This is what Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, had to say about Navalny.
The case of Navalny has gained foreign political resonance artificially and baselessly. Everything is happening to Navalny in connection with his returning, and detention falls within the competence of law enforcement.
Victor, can I come to you? The Kremlin is obviously saying that the international reaction surrounding Navalny is misplaced, it's wrong, and they don't seem concerned about what the reactions may lead to, whether that's more sanctions or not.
Well, many of the problems that we have seen, many of the problems and issues that the Kremlin is facing now have been self-created, have been created by actions that were counterproductive. First of all, Moscow has refused to open a criminal case, full-fledged criminal investigation into the poisoning of Navalny. Secondly, upon Navalny's return to Moscow, he was detained and arrested on charge of skipping a probation check while he was in the Charité hospital in Berlin, recovering from the poisoning, and it is quite obvious that those actions do not fall within the constitutional or within the democratic process. Now, if the Russian government would follow the democratic process, Navalny would have to face criticism from his opponents, both from those in the government and from those in the opposition circles. Not everyone in the Russian opposition is happy with him or his views. So in a way, the government's fear of Navalny, the government's treatment of Navalny as a formidable enemy, as a formidable opponent, is letting him gain more points. So these moves by the Kremlin have so far been quite counterproductive and have not achieved the goals that they had initially set for themselves.
Okay. So Alexander, what do you think the international reaction should be in terms of sanctions? Or let me put it another way. There have been sanctions on Russian officials. We've had those already. I don't know what impact they've had, but the EU is now talking about the next steps after the treatment of the protesters. Is it prepared to go further? Is it prepared, for example, to put Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline, on the table, do you think?
Well, I mean, it depends on whom you're talking to. Americans are already putting as much sanctions on Nord Stream 2 as they possibly can. I mean, so there's not much more than they can do there. The Germany is a different matter. But the key point is that what are the sanctions are for? Is it to put pressure to release Navalny, to change the Russian domestic politics? Or is it just to express the disapproval of the Russian authorities and have some kind of just punishment for the sake of it. So I mean, the basic calculation, so far as the Kremlin is concerned, is that if they give in on Navalny under international pressure, release him and let him go about his business as before, they would lose control over the internal situation. I mean, they can't afford to do it now. I mean, I agree. That they kind of mishandled the whole affair since the poisoning and the poisoning itself, of course. But now that they went on this sort of hardline stance, I mean, I can't see them letting it go. And the sanctions will only strengthen their resolve in kind of dealing with Navalny in a harsh manner as possible. Because, I think as Theresa was saying, there's a line, or Lavrov was saying, of Navalny being agent of the West, is the key, I think, for the Russian authorities messaged about it. Piling up more sanctions on Russia would just kind of play into that narrative that Navalny is nothing but a Western stooge.
This is what the EU foreign policy chief had to say about sanctions. This is Josep Borrell explaining what is meant by possibly putting more sanctions on Russia.
Pressure means sanctions. Yes. Pressure means attitude, relationship. We are on the way of sanctions. It has been sanctions. It can be more sanctions. But sanctions by itself is not a policy. Sanctions is a tool. And apart from sanctioning, you have to continue reaching out and discussing.
Theresa, let me come to you. What are you expecting to see from the EU, and how strongly can the West react to what's happening in Russia?
Well, the EU is quite divided on this. We've seen it with the Baltic states and Poland. They want to sanction Nord Stream 2. Obviously, Germany does not want that. So this will be quite an interesting balancing act. The EU is unable to speak with one voice, but the Baltic states plus Poland have been very vocal about this. And it remains to be seen how the sanctions will be handled. The other issue is when Navalny was taken into custody, he had a list of 8 elite Russian leaders that he wanted to be sanctioned. And so he doesn't want the sanctions to affect the Russian population, but to affect really Putin's inner circle.
I wonder where we see this going. What happens next? Victor, we know that Navalny is facing a trial at the end of his detention. It's possible he could spend many years in jail. Is that Putin's choice? Is that what he wants to do? Just lock Navalny up and hope that everything calms down?
Well, as far as the sanctions are concerned, at this point, the Russian government really understands and expects that the Nord Stream 2 project is not going to become functional at this point or anytime soon until there are major changes in relations between Russia and the United States and in a wider manner between Russia and the West as a whole. So even if Nord Stream 2 would be completed physically, it would still not become operational because the insurers are not willing to work under the current sanctions regime imposed by Washington. Now, as far as the expectations of the Kremlin at this point in the domestic situation, first and foremost, the Kremlin would like to ensure a more or less stable process of election process, the election, I'm of course talking about the parliamentary elections that are coming up in the fall. And of course the Kremlin is worried that if these protests continue, and if they become wider, more widespread, and if a harsher reaction is going to follow, the Kremlin is of course concerned about how that is going to look not just outside Russia, but what reaction that would garner from the population as a whole, population at large in Russia. Those would not be good pictures for Russia's partners abroad, but those would also not be good pictures for Russia inside. The Kremlin does not want a repetition of what happened in 2011, 2012, but it understands that it could possibly have a repetition or even larger protests. So at this point, it is using various instruments at its disposal, both police and prophylactic measures against the protest movement, and time will show how successful they will be at that. At this point, they have not been very successful.
No, indeed. Alexander, do you agree? How do you see this playing out as we head towards parliamentary elections in Russia?
Well, yeah, I think the key for the opposition is to sustain the momentum. I think we already talked about that. There'll be kind of key points for them to rally support. I mean, there'll be trial of Navalny in the end of February. You have various processes in electoral campaign, including registration of the candidates in the summer and so forth. And yeah, I mean, sort of building up to this big event of denouncing the parliamentary results in October, I guess, around that. But I mean, you have to kind of look at the Kremlin as well, sort of moves. I mean, because it has, a rich history in front of itself, not least what's happening recently in Belarus. In terms of kind of avoiding mistakes made by Lukashenko there. I think that's why they were relatively constrained, their response to the protests. They don't want to create kind of too large a picture of violence, or rather, if it comes.
Is Putin looking at Belarus and worrying that might be repeated in Russia?
Well, I mean, they certainly worry about it. I mean, but Belarus. I mean, if you look, I mean, they're planning now already how to do the elections. I mean, there was a meeting with the governors by Kiriyenko, who is in charge of the domestic politics in the Kremlin, saying that this is the targets, but we don't want to have targets to be too much out of reality. So we can't get when the polling is 30% for United Russia, we can't give them 60. So they're kind of going for 45, for example, right? So and there are various issues. I mean, they can do kind of rally their own support. I mean, with this protest going on, I mean, there's also kind of various strategies they can adopt in terms of, I mean, look at these protesters. Do you want another Maidan like in Ukraine, destruction of Russian, stability and so forth, to appeal to the voters? Because I think, you have to kind of also distinguish. There is people very discontent with Putin, but not necessarily the majority of people, right? So you still might have this sort of silent majority which not enthusiastic about Putin and tired of him being there, endlessly.
Okay.
But at the same time, they might not necessarily want the revolution either.
And Theresa, what do you think Russia's going to do with Navalny? And is Navalny's struggle inspiring new Navalny's, new opposition leaders?
Well, we've seen a huge support from the young people. Over 125 million hits on TikTok for various videos related to the protests. But the issue now is they try to have managed democracy. So they have to somehow have someone they can control in the opposition. And Navalny doesn't seem to be the person. We saw a recent election outside of Moscow where the Kremlin candidate, they needed an opposition person, so they chose a cleaning lady with absolutely no experience politically. She won by a landslide, which was a barometer of how people are just so sick and tired of the system. So it seemed to be breaking down. If Putin stays in power, he will be 83 by the end of it. Does he want to rule that long? And the problem of this authoritarian regime is, how do you come up with the next person to take power? And this managed democracy, this illusion of democracy, is causing the Kremlin a lot of headaches right now. And I think Navalny, we're on a collision course, and it remains to be seen how the Kremlin can manage this.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out in Russia. Viktor Olevich, Theresa Fallon, Alexander Titov, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Great to have you with me. And you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.